Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about subsistence base or subsistence strategy, which is just a fancy way of saying how people extract calories from the environment, right? How do they make a living, so to speak? How are they getting by? And subsistence base is important because one of the things that we see is that what you do to get calories from the environment has a massive impact on the other areas of a culture, the other areas of life, in terms of their religious ideology, their political organization, their social organization. All of those kinds of things are strongly impacted by this. Okay, so it's a good sort of early way to start talking about different cultures and different ideas. And there are four big ones that we talk about. I'll mention here that there's an argument to be made for a fifth, right? But there's four subsistence patterns that we talk about. Foraging, which is often, a lot of people call it hunting and gathering. But it's hunting, it's gathering, it's scavenging, it's fishing, it's all of those different things. And so we kind of use this umbrella term of foraging. There's horticulture, which is basically gardening. We'll talk about it. Pastoralism, which is the herding of animals. And agriculture, which is sort of more intensive farming using technologies. There is an argument to be made here that we should really have a fifth, which is industrialization. And even though that's not exactly a subsistence pattern, it's not how you're getting calories. Industrialized societies still rely on agriculture, but the truth is there's a really big difference in some of these agricultural societies when you talk about, agriculturalists from 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or in some of the world today still, and then compare that to, say, us or Europe, where you see this really intensive industrialization, and so little people actually involved in agriculture, right? But we'll talk about these as we go. So the first one is foragers. And foraging is what we did for 99% of our history. Human beings evolved in Central Africa, as I've mentioned, 200,000 years ago. And for 190,000 years, every single human being was a forager. We were scavenging first, and so that's things like a lot of animals that will make a kill, like lions and stuff, will eat a little bit of it, and then they'll sort of stash it in the bushes or up in a tree, things like that, and then humans would come along and steal that. And we can tell that from the archaeological record, actually, where we find the bones of animals, and they have teeth marks of lions or jaguars or things like that. And then inside of that bite mark is actually cut marks from human beings butchering it, right? So we do know that we were scavenging quite a bit. And later on started hunting more and more. Again, fishing became very, very important. One of the things that I want to mention is that when we think about forager societies and hunting and gathering, a lot of people like to really focus on the hunting aspect of that. The funny thing being is that for the vast majority of foragers that we have found around the globe, that we've studied with around the globe, in truth, gathering accounts for way more of their caloric intake than hunting does. The exception to that is subarctic groups, such as what's commonly called the Eskimo or the Inuit. These groups do, most of their calories comes from meat. About 92% of their calories is actually meat. It's damn near an all meat diet. And for parts of the year, it becomes that. But in other groups, that's almost flipped. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, such as the San, the Hadza, in a lot of Amazonian groups, you're maybe going to see like 12 or 15% of their calories coming from animals. And 80+% is going to be coming from plants, right? So again, whenever people talk about like a paleo diet, right, or something like that, I always laugh because there just isn't a way that we're supposed to eat. There's no supposed to with humans. We are capable of a massive range of behavior and adaptation. And so everything from damn near all meat to damn near all vegetables is the paleo diet. So take your pick. It's also silly because you'll find with a lot of people now, like with the paleo diet, and let me say the paleo diet, according to nutritionists, seems to be a pretty healthy way to eat. So I'm not saying don't do it, but the idea that it is paleo in any way is absolutely a fantasy. For example, with grains, a lot of the paleo diet sort of supporters say, well, you know, we 190,000 years we weren't eating grains until domestication, which we'll talk about in a second, and then we started. Well, the truth is actually no. The forager peoples eat plenty of grains. They eat wild grains all the time, right? Forager societies basically do not have a food taboo, and a food taboo is just as it sounds. It's something that is sort of prohibited or banned. You can think of the modern day thing, for example, for Jewish and Muslim peoples, like pork is a food taboo, shrimp for Jews, for Hindus, like cow is a taboo, like animals usually in general, right? Those are food taboos. Forager societies really don't have food taboos. They eat everything. They make the most extensive use of the resources in their environment, right? Not as opposed to intensive use, but the most extensive. They are utilizing everything that they possibly can, right? The only time you see a food taboo is for various religious reasons. So, for example, in some of these groups, they sort of identify with an animal, what's often called a spirit animal, though it's a more complex idea than pop culture would have you believe. But it is basically that the belief that my group, my lineage, my clan, whatever, descended from this animal, that many, you know, eons ago, this animal sort of gave rise to us. And therefore that actually makes that animal my brother or my sister. It is literally family. And so if I ate that animal, it would be the same thing as cannibalism, right? And so then you'll see like, well, you know, we're not allowed to eat bears. You know, other people can, and that's fine, but I can't because that would be cannibalism, right? So that's the idea kind of behind that. Forager societies are, to talk about their structure a little bit, typically very, very small for obvious reasons that, you know, if you and I are living in an area and we are gathering up all of the fruits and vegetables, the nuts, the berries, the tubers, like root crops, if we're hunting the animals, if we're using firewood, if we're fishing in the ponds and the lakes, it's probably not going to take very long for us to really deplete the resources in that environment. And so this is why forager groups tend to be very small. You find, you know, 20 to 50 is probably the most common. Extremely rarely you'll get up to 100. Excuse me. So it's necessary for them to stay small. It's also then necessary for them to move a great deal, right? Because we're gonna use up all of these resources, and so we need to head to a new area. So sometimes that's going to be seasonal. There are groups that move. I think the most, ever documented was a group in the Amazon, the Maku, who it's a subgroup of the Maku, who move like 70 or 80 times a year. So I mean, they're moving. You know, sometimes they'll move a few times a week, right? Because they're going to use up those resources so rapidly. Probably more common is a seasonal move, and so, you know, things like, you know, we're gonna head over to the coast during times when, you know, fish are running or birds are migrating. We're gonna head inland, we're gonna head north, we're gonna head south at these various times, especially when it comes to things like water, if there's a dry season in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And so these groups are gonna be small, they're gonna be very mobile, they're gonna move a great deal. This is also why material culture, literal possessions, tend to be very limited with them, because if we're moving weekly or even just monthly, you don't want to have to carry a ton of stuff. You're not going to want things that are going to burden you and weigh you down. So material culture tends to be very, very limited, right? Belonging to the group itself is kin-based, right? meaning that everybody in this group is related to each other. Okay. And because of this, you oftentimes see forager groups that have various ceremonies and times of year that different bands, and that's the political organization that we call it, is a band, not a tribe. We'll talk about tribes later. Bands will come together for various reasons, various ceremonies. And the reason for that is, how else are you ever going to get married? How else are you going to ever have kids? Because if everybody that I live with is a family member, then that's a problem, right? So you see these things where they oftentimes come together, stuff like that. Excuse me. As I said, forager groups, their political organization is called a band. They don't have a formal leader. By definition, you will oftentimes see that foragers have what's called like a big man, where it's an individual that is smart, that is kind of a natural leader, those kinds of things. But they don't have what you and I would think of as political power. They do not have power over other individuals. People listen to their advice because it's usually good, but they don't have to do what the sort of head guy says, or a headman is what we usually call it. They are individuals that usually have a lot of experience. They understand the environment. They know how to get, food. They're good hunters, that kind of thing. But foragers are probably the most free society. We like to think of ourselves as having all of this freedom, but the truth is we really don't. And we'll talk about this with political organization, but lots and lots of people have the power to tell us what to do, right? From the big to the little. You see something you like, you can't take it. We have laws. You're not allowed to steal. You're not allowed to hurt people if they piss you off. You're not even allowed to drive the speed limit, drive the speed that you want, right? We have a limit on that. We have lots and lots of ways in which we have allowed others to take control of our lives. Foragers don't have that. Foragers have absolute autonomy. They don't have, nobody can tell them what to do, right? You are your own individual. You make your own determinations about things, right? So foraging is this interesting aspect for us. Because it was what we did for 99% of our history, right? It wasn't until 10,000 years ago and the Neolithic Revolution that we had domestication of plants and domestication of animals and sort of got into these other things, And so we've spent a lot of time studying foragers. With that said, there are not many foragers left. There's only about 700,000, maybe 750,000 foragers left in the world. And so, a mid-sized American city can be larger than the group that we're talking about here, right? It is a dying way of life, in part because it requires a lot of land. As I mentioned, you're going to move around. You're going to do, you need space to support yourself. And that's tough in the modern world where we like to put up fences and we like to own property and all of these things. And so there are fewer and fewer foragers in the world. And it is a way of life that is slowly dying, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we've talked a lot about them in anthropology. We've been focused on them for a very, very long time. Because it is this critical thing in our evolutionary development, in our cultural evolution, and things like that. So, as I mentioned, about 10,000 years ago, we have what's called the Neolithic Revolution, which neo is new, lithic means stone, so this is the new Stone Age as opposed to the old Stone Age, right? And this is where we have domestication, right? And domestication is just the breeding of plants and animals and things like that. It's also important to note here that forager peoples did actually have an early version of domestication, right? They did have the ability and the knowledge of plants and animals, and they did purposefully plant things. So, for example, we'll talk about this with historical ecology in a moment. In the Amazon jungle, we do know that individuals were intentionally planting things that they needed. Probably based on the archaeological evidence, the first plant that was ever domesticated, meaning that it, like we bred it to be what we wanted, we intentionally planted it, is gourds, right? There's the things that hang by vines, right? If you've seen them, it's kind of a hard woody thing, shape comes down, bulbs out. The reason why is, of course, it's really useful. If you're a forager people that are moving all of the time, a gourd, they're hollow in the middle, right? So you can cut the top off, put a plug in there, and you can carry water, you can carry food, you can carry all kinds of stuff with a gourd. And so it's really the suitcase of the ancient world. And so gourds were probably one of the first things that we domesticated. The oldest animal domesticate is dogs, actually. Dogs half domesticated themselves, to be honest, it looks like, just by coming around us, by following us, those kinds of things. Dogs have such an even temperament because, of course, if you've got this wolf following you around that keeps trying to eat your children or bite you, you're probably going to kill it. And so there was a sort of not natural selection, but intentional selection, where we were killing the ones that were mean, keeping the ones that were kind. Fast forward 10,000 years, and you have dogs that are, well, super nice, and you can, this formerly wild animal that ate people, you can have it around a baby, those kinds of things, right? But with domestication 10,000 years ago, we see an absolutely critical shift in human life and in human society. Once we went from foraging for food to intentionally planting food, it absolutely changes it all. One of the things, the biggest thing, is that we become settled. We're no longer nomadic. We are going to live in cities now. We're going to live in one place. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. Like, if I'm going to spend all of this time to clear land, to cut down the trees, to burn off the underbrush, to turn the soil, to put in fertilizer, manure, things like that, to dig a trench so that from the pond so that I can irrigate my crops. I'm going to build a fence around it so that the deer don't eat my shit all the time, right? I'm going to do all of this work and plant this food. I don't want to wander off and then hope that some other group of humans who's roaming around doesn't come up and just eat it all, right? And so I'm going to stay right here to make sure. Now, again, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that, again, human culture is always adaptable, and we do whatever we can. Just as foragers did intentionally plant crops, once we have domestication, quote unquote, and we're growing crops, hunting was still a really critical part of it, right? And so in all of these, it's really about a sort of suite of adaptations that people had, right? So we start to get settlements, we start to get cities, we start to get social classes, we start to get political hierarchy. And the reason why is because, of course, once we're growing this food, we're going to need to make sure that it is done fairly in a certain way. Which leads then ultimately to a lot of unfairness, to be honest with you, right? As I kind of mentioned with like social classes, for foragers, there are no social classes, right? Everyone is equal. Everyone's on the same footing. It is not until we get into domestication that we see a big difference happening, right? But it makes sense in a certain way that this is how it went, because with the necessary input, right? So, for example, I was talking about clearing a field and all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that alone, right? We as a band, we as a group are going to decide we should start planting. We'll stay near the plants. We'll harvest them. And so we're going to get organized. Some of us are going to start cutting the trees down, and some of us are going to start digging the irrigation trench, and some of us are going to start building a fence, and some of us are going to start building a warehouse or a granary in order to store those crops, right? Because the whole idea is that we're going to grow so much that it'll last. It'll be here for a long time. It'll feed us, for the whole year or for half the year until the other growing season, that kind of thing. And so we're going to need to divide up these tasks, right? And so you start to have a political hierarchy, somebody that says, hey, you do this, you do this, you do this. We've got different teams. We've got different, jobs that need to be accomplished, So we start to see that a lot, right? We're going to grow more than we're going to eat right away. That's the whole idea, which is going to lead to surplus. And surplus leads to a number of things, including social classes, because if somebody has more than somebody else, we've just introduced the idea of class, right? You're also going to see things like trade, right? We grow this, but maybe our neighbors grow something else, and we're real tired of eating corn all of the damn time. And so maybe we can trade with our neighbors who have beans or rice or squash or whatever it is, right? So you start to see trade coming into this, okay? You start to get to a state level society at this point. We'll talk about this with political organization, but basically a state level society is the idea that a state, and we say state meaning not like the state of Florida, but really meaning like a nation state. A state level society means that that political hierarchy now has power over you. You are no longer autonomous. They are allowed to tell you what to do, and they have individuals in the society who will enforce those rules, right? And make sure that you're following what to do, okay? Those kinds of things. So this is an absolutely massive change to human life. We had never lived like this before. We'll talk about maybe some of the origins of this when we talk about political organization next. But so it becomes a really big thing here. You also get state-sponsored religion. Traditionally, you see this quite a bit, that religion and politics become intertwined, which probably sounds familiar in the current era. But by that, I mean that, the state is going to say, this is our faith, this is our religion, this is what we worship and who we are, those kinds of things. So with domestication, you get what is called horticulture. And I had mentioned before, horticulture is basically gardening and not exactly farming. The distinction between horticulture and agriculture is something that we debate all of the time. Traditionally, what we say is that horticulture is farming with only human power. So no plow animals, no draft animals, no tractors, those kinds of things. It's just sort of what you can do, okay? Horticulture, again, is where we see class. It's where we see inequality for a start. In forager societies, they're an equitable society. Everybody's on the same footing. With horticulture, that begins to change. We also see pastoralism with the domestication of animals. Pastoralists are semi-nomadic, meaning that they move around because they are reliant on these animals and grazing area, and so you see them moving quite a bit and moving around often, right? All of these are explained in great depth in your book, and so I don't want to go too far into it, but I want to kind of mention a couple of things with it. So pastoralism is herding, right? You're herding animals. Traditionally in anthropology, we always said that pastoral societies were very militaristic. And the reason for that is that obviously if I'm a horticulturalist and I have been planting my fields and my group has been busting our ass to make sure that we're growing enough crops to eat and survive and stuff, I don't want you to herd your goats or your cows through there and have them eat all of my stuff, right? That's going to be a problem. And so pastoral societies often run into lots of conflict because of that. However, that is tempered by the fact that pastoral societies also are very reliant on trade. Excuse me. Because they are not settled, because all they have is these animals, because they're not usually growing crops, they're going to have to trade with their horticultural neighbors, right? And I, being a horticulturalist, would be really excited to get one of your cows, and you would be really excited to get, whatever it is that I have that I'm growing. I'm also living in a city, a town, and so being in one place means that my material culture starts to grow. As I mentioned before, material culture for foragers tends to be very, very limited because I got to move all the time. I don't want to tote tons of shit with me, right? And I don't have a draft animal, right? I don't have a pack mule or whatever, right? But once we're settled into cities and towns, now I can start sort of making more and have craft specialization, right? We grow enough food that maybe not everybody has to be dedicated to getting food. In a forager society, 100% of the people are working towards getting enough food, right? In a horticultural society, you really early on see maybe 10 or 15% of the society doesn't need to do that. As horticulturalism grows and expands and those kinds of things, it can be even more than that. That means that we can have people who can become really good at other things. They don't have to just be trying to get food all the time. We can feed them. And so you get things like professional soldiers. You get things like professional pot makers or professional tool workers or things like that. And just like everything else in life, when you have somebody that does it professionally, it's a hell of a lot better than an amateur is going to do it, right? And so we've got all these really great trade goods as a horticultural people, which pastoralists would like. This is where you see things like metalworking come in, and while stone tools are amazing and very sharp, right, they also tend to be a little more fragile and not last as long. Like a steel knife is going to last a hell of a lot longer than a stone knife will, right? Not that a stone knife doesn't work, but man, this steel knife, I might give it to my kids at some point. That stone knife, I'm going to need a new one in pretty short order, right? So while pastoralists do come into conflict with people because of this constant herding of animals, because they're going to graze this area and eat all the grass, and so we got to go to this new area and this other area and stuff like that, yeah, that's going to put them in conflict with people, but they also have to get along with those people. And so that's something that's going to temper. The fourth one is agriculture, right? And agriculture, as opposed to horticulture, is the idea of, the book says like it's more intensive, right? Which is to say that we are putting more inputs into the ground. So things like fertilizer, things like pesticides, things like irrigation, stuff like that. But again, traditionally, we often say that it is the use of more than human power, right? So not just our sweat and labor, but also draft animals, plow animals, tractors, things like that, right? And so agricultural societies can be pretty small scale, all the way up to us, 330 million people in the United States living, plus more than that now, I think, living from this, right? And it allows us that intensification of it and that use of other energy sources to do the farming means that we have even more people that are able to not take part in the food getting process. And so, for example, in the US now, I think it's down only like 1.7% of Americans are directly involved in the food getting process, right? Meaning the raising of livestock, the growing of plants, the harvesting of these things. Very few of us have any personal connection to the food that we are growing. And there is obviously a lot of problems with that, right? So one of the things that I want to talk about is the tragedy of the commons, which is mentioned in your book. This is a very, very famous article from Hardin in 1968. And the idea of the commons, right? The commons is like common areas, like common or communally owned spaces. Okay, so today that would be things like a quad in the college building where all of us sit, all of us use it. There's tables, there's chairs. It's open for anybody. Those kinds of things. In back in the day, this was like commons referred to like grazing areas, right? And places that all of us could put our livestock communally, right? And it was commonly owned by all of us. And Hardin made an argument that commons are always going to be a failure. And what this and because he argued that that is because people are going to overplay it, right? Some people are going to be selfish and they're going to put too many animals on it, and that's going to degrade the area and it's going to hurt everybody because this one person was selfish. This article in many ways was a huge argument for capitalism, right? It was what he was arguing was it's kind of a strange article in a lot of ways because it was arguing against welfare and sort of helping people in that way because he said, people will abuse it. But he was also trying to explain this idea of commonly held area that people will be selfish and they're going to take more than their share, which is why private property is better, right? Private property being the heart of capitalism. And private property is better because then if it's only your land, you're going to take care of it. You're not going to put 1,000 cows on an area that should only have 100 because you know that it will long term screw you up, right? There's a lot of problems with this argument. The biggest one being that what he failed to understand, right? Hardin was not an anthropologist. He had not studied with any peoples. I believe that he was an economist, but I'd have to look at that. But this was all armchair philosophy. In truth, common areas don't do this, right? And so this argument it was supposed to be an argument against communism, against socialism, against commonly held areas, those kinds of things. But the truth is that they don't get degraded because all cultures have rules and norms and practices that help mitigate this, right? Everybody has ways in which they understand you cannot do these things, and that we have to protect it. And kind of an easy, though simplistic example is what I mentioned before, these common areas on campus maybe, where we all are. Everybody knows that everybody else is using this. And so, for example, you pick up your trash after you're there. You don't put your dirty shoes up on the seat and stuff like that, right? There are rules and norms of behavior that help mitigate these things. A good example of this is actually my research in Swaziland. When I was there doing my work and interviewing people about the different plants that they use, people would oftentimes list the different trees that they gather firewood from. Like, oh, this is a good tree, this is a good tree, this is a good tree. I get firewood of those, right? And I was doing an interview once, and a woman told me like a couple of trees, and I recognized the names. I knew that they were common firewood trees. And I said, so you, she said, oh, these 3 trees. And I said, you gather firewood from those? She was like, no, I don't, but they're good trees for it. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, well, you don't gather them? And she was like, no, huh? I was like, but they're good for firewood. She's like, oh yeah, they're really good trees, but I don't use them. And I was like, well, why not? And she said, well, I can't. My clan isn't allowed to. And I was like, hold on, I don't understand. And so this woman finally explained it to me that each clan, right, and in the modern era, your last name is actually your clan's name traditionally. And so each clan is allowed to gather the wood of certain trees, and other trees are sort of taboo and forbidden from you. So if I'm in the Dlamini clan, I can gather, these 3 trees. And your clan, the Mambas, right, you're not allowed to gather those trees. But there's going to be some trees that you're allowed to gather that I can't, or the next guy can't, or that clan can't. And so what this does is it makes sure that there is enough in the commonly held areas of the forest that all of us are able to go, and by restricting it a little bit for all of us, there's enough for everyone, right? And so the tragedy of the commons is discussed in your book. But the truth is, this is something that economists like to use all the time to try to explain why, you got to have private property and this kind of stuff. But it's an absolutely terrible example of that because it's not real, right? In truth, what we see in the actual damn world is that capitalism typically is the one that overplays resources and does not think about sort of future planning, right? In communally held areas, individuals are very cognizant of the fact that this isn't just mine and I can't take too much, and there's going to be rules like I talked about so that you don't. But it's when capitalism comes in that we see people looking at short-term gain and profit over a common good, right? And so while this is used all of the time, if you take economics, I guarantee you're going to talk about the tragedy of the commons. In truth, in actual practice, when you stop just philosophizing on the damn couch all the time and get out of the library, in the real world, we find the dead opposite to be the fact, right? We also, your book also mentions, and I want to talk about historical ecology a little bit. Historical ecology is the fact that by studying the way that we are extracting calories, what we're really studying is our relationship with the environment, right? We're studying the ways in which humans have built an environmental relationship over century and millennia. And one of the things that historical ecology teaches us is that we have always radically altered our environment. And so this idea that environmental impacts are new, or that people in the modern era are doing something odd, that's simply not true. A good example of this is the Amazon. A man named Bill Belay actually did a lot of research on this, and what he found was that at least 12%, and since then that number's gone up a little bit, but at least 12% of the Amazon, which is supposed to be this like the epitome of a natural untouched environment, at least 12% of it is created by humans, right? By chopping down trees that we don't want, by burning the underbrush, by intentionally planting other tree species that maybe make fruit or nuts or things like that that we eat and that we want. We have radically altered that environment. When Europeans first came to the United States, what is now the United States, they were absolutely shocked that all up and down the East Coast, they always described it as a park. They said, this looks like a park in England. They said it's beautiful and, grass and trees and like these real open forests and sort of rolling hills and lots of wildlife and stuff. All of that was because Native Americans were absolutely altering that environment, right? This is what we call an anthropogenic environment, meaning that it is a human-created environment. And they did that primarily by the use of fire, that they would constantly burn the underbrush off because it opened the forest up. It meant that like bigger, healthier trees could produce more by getting rid of these sort of smaller saplings that were competing for resources. By clearing that underbrush, it was much easier to hunt deer and rabbits and bear and this kind of thing, And so these are created environments, right? So, people that want to say that, maybe we have this kind of fantasy now that we are not a part of the natural environment, or that our relationship to nature is always going to be exploitive or destructive or problematic. None of that's really true. Everywhere that humans have ever gone for the last 200,000 years, we have radically altered that environment to suit our needs more, right? Whether it be burning the underbrush, or killing trees that don't produce anything and planting new ones, or killing off all of the predators that compete with us. This is why, go to California. I live in California. The state flag has a bear, has a bear on it, a grizzly. There are no more grizzlies in California. They killed them more than 100 years ago because they hunt us and they also hunt things that we hunt, and we didn't like the competition, so we absolutely wiped them out, right? Look at the argument that's happening about wolves out west in areas where wolves have been hunted to extinction. We're trying to reintroduce them. And the biggest opposition to this is farmers, because they're like, I have cows, I've got sheep, I've got whatever. I don't want wolves around here trying to eat my livestock, right? So we've radically altered all environments. The idea that there is any quote unquote, untouched or pristine nature left is silly. We have impacted literally everywhere on the globe. Right? We are a part of nature. We are a key part of nature. We are the apex predator, right? And so that's an important thing to understand, that when you're looking at the natural world, you are looking at the natural world, but you're looking at the natural world as we chose to make it, right? Everywhere, literally everywhere. And this also gets into foodways, right? How we eat, what we eat, the things that individuals make, this kind of stuff, right? And for a sort of contemporary thing to talk about just a little bit is that I mentioned earlier the ideas behind the paleo diet, excuse me. But one of the things that I want to talk about is GMOs, right? GMO stands for genetically modified organisms. If you aren't familiar with it, there's been a huge amount of controversy over GMOs lately as people have grown more and more uncomfortable with the idea of us modifying these plants. Let me say a couple of things about this controversy. One, it's important to note that everything that you eat is genetically modified. The picture that you see is actually corn. On the left there, you have teosintine, which is like the wild version of corn, what corn started out as and evolved naturally into, right? It produces this very small crop, if you will, these seeds, these kernels, as we often call them, right? As you can see, there's a quarter there for reference, right? It's barely bigger than a quarter. It's like one row of kernels, these kinds of things. Now, that obviously wasn't what we wanted. We're trying to get, the most bang for our buck. And so we had not natural selection, we had selective breeding, we had intentional breeding, that we would take the biggest, the best, the strongest, the most productive, and we would plant those seeds so that they would produce more. And a lot of people are surprised that humans did this, but it's really not. Foragers, if you think about it, foragers spent literally all of their time outside. We don't anymore, and so that surprised us. There was a study that was done that found the average American spends less time outside than is federally required for prisoners. If you're a prisoner, you are allowed to have 1 hour of outside time a day. And the average American spends about 57 minutes outside. And that's everything from like walking to your house to your car to, Whole Foods or whatever the hell you're doing, right? So, I mean, like prisoners spend more time outside than we do. But if you're a forager, you're literally outside all the time. And you have a very intimate relationship with plants because this is where most of your food's coming from. So they understood life cycles, they understood seeds, they understood all of that, right? So it's not surprising that they would be able to identify like, oh, this one is growing more, this one has bigger fruit, this one has more fruit, let's plant that, because for various reasons we've come to understand that that's going to make more for us down the road, right? And so that's what we did with corn, and it turned into this absolute monstrosity with, instead of one single row, just hundreds of kernels on there, right? So the idea that it's like, oh, I don't want to eat, sort of genetically modified. Everything that you eat is genetically modified, right? All domesticates are corn and squash and beans and potatoes and you name it, right? All of it is. And if you eat animals, cows and sheep and goats and pigs, they're not at all like their wild counterparts, genetically speaking. We've radically altered them, right? So all of us are eating GMOs all the time. With that said, I'll also point out that there is a big difference between that, where I am just picking the biggest, healthiest crop and planting it. There's a big difference between that and like what we see with GMOs now, where we are genetically manipulating them at the DNA level, so that there are crops now that have things like pesticides that rather than having to spray it, we've spliced like the DNA for a pest resistant thing into it. Like the idea of like, oh, wash your produce to wash off like pesticides and stuff. It's a part of its actual genetic code now. That's a big damn difference, right? And so that is why there is a lot of concern about them. All studies have found that GMOs do not have a negative impact on people. And I know some of you will be upset by that and say, no, they're terrible for us. There is no scientific evidence to back that notion up. But again, I'll also say that the studies that have been done on it are pretty limited. And so doing a study that's really long term is very, very expensive. And so a lot of times it will look at, people for 6 months and the GMOs that they're eating and stuff like that, and try to determine if there's a negative impact. Except that 6 months isn't really long enough to get at some of the deeper issues that might be involved in this. And so I would argue, yes, the science is pretty clear that it doesn't have a negative impact on our biology, but I don't know that the science is really robust enough for us to trust that. I will also say that the science is robust in the negative environmental impacts of GMOs, because GMOs tend to be sort of monocrop agriculture. It is, 100, 500, 1,000 acres planted with this one crop, and that is having a devastating impact on biodiversity, on bees and butterflies and pollinators and wildlife and all of this stuff. So it is absolutely terrible from an environmental standpoint. And so that's, a sort of fair point. But again, we run into an issue here that GMOs are how we feed the world. And GMOs are extremely productive, right? They grow big, they grow fast. They produce a lot. And so this often surprises people. In many parts of the U.S., all over the U.S., we have less farmland now than we did 200 years ago. And the reason for that is because GMOs tend to be very productive, right? And so what used to be 1,000 acres, I can grow the same amount of food on 100. Right. And so New England, for example, was just completely farmland in the 1700s and 1800s. And by the late 1800s, really early 1900s, it started to revert back to forest because we didn't have to have farms there anymore. We were able to grow enough food through intensification, both GMOs, but also other practices like the use of fertilizers, chemical pesticides, things like that, better farming practices, crop rotation, better tractors, things like that. We were able to vastly reduce the amount of land that we had as farm, and it went back to being sort of wild forest again, right? And so there's benefits to these things. The other big thing is, as I said, this is how we feed the world. If we don't want to grow GMOs, we need to decide which billion or maybe 2 people get to starve to death this year, right? I try not to buy GMOs, but let me be blunt, that is a very first world option. I have the money to decide that I want to buy, organic, all natural produce and shit like that. If you are part of the 1.2 billion people that make $1 a day or less, that's not necessarily an option. Fully half the world, about 3.5 billion people, make $2.50 a day or less. You don't get to decide that, like, well, I don't care for the farming practices of that, I won't buy it. That's just not an option. And so I don't particularly like GMOs. I do have some issues with it. I also have to recognize that having an issue with this food is a privilege of the developed world, right? And there's been a lot of very negative impacts with these, and this is part of my reason for not liking them, is that the biology set aside, the nutrition set aside, there are some serious impacts of GMOs on people, right? This is one particular article that talks about farmers in India that in the last, 20, 25 years, more than 250,000 cotton farmers in India have committed suicide. And the reason why is because of how GMOs and these multinational corporations operate. So one of the things about a GMO is they're usually they're genetically engineered so that they don't produce seeds. And the reason being is that if I spend all of this time making this really productive crop, one of the nice things about being a farmer is that you can always feed yourself, right? Is that traditionally farmers would keep like 10% of their harvest aside as seed for next year. And so I'm self-sustaining, right? Well, the problem is now is that we've engineered these crops to not have seeds. And so every year you have to come to me, a multinational corporation like Monsanto's, and buy your seeds again, right? And so, but what happens if you have a bad year, right? Which is what happens with farming. My grandfather was a farmer. My whole family up until my father's generation were farmers. Even a lot of my cousins kept with it and stuff like that. And so I grew up spending summers on the farm. You have bad years. The rains don't come. There's too many bugs one year. It's too damn hot. It's too damn cold. You have a late freeze or an early freeze, right? You lose your crop sometimes, right? And the problem is with these GMOs, right? What this calls GM, genetically modified cotton, is that I bought it from you. And of course, I've bought it on credit because I don't have the money. I'm going to grow this thing, sell it to make money. So I've got credit to you. And you're going to extend me credit. I go into debt. I get these seeds. I plant them. Well, if I have a bad year, I don't have a harvest and I don't get to sell anything. And now I'm in debt, right? Or, maybe the market goes down, whatever. I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. And I don't make enough to pay off my debt, right? Even if I bring it in, it's like, well, I sold it and the price dropped. And now I'm broke and I'm in debt and I don't have seeds to plant next year. So I need somebody to loan me more money. But of course, I never paid off my old debt. So you're not going to loan me more money again, right? And so in India, this has led to a ton of suicides because it gets complex. But in some areas there, basically like widows and orphans are looked after. Right. But they kind of have a similar philosophy as us in a lot of ways, sadly, like, oh, if you're a man, you should work and earn and all this bullshit. And so a lot of men actually, when they get into these bad situations, they're in debt. No one will loan them money. They don't have seeds. They'll kill themselves because they at least know that way their wife and their children won't starve to death. The state will take care of them. Right. There's an absolutely wonderful, though super depressing documentary about this called The Killing Fields, where it talks about all of these farmers. And many of them, because they have no other means, the way that they commit suicide is that they drink the pesticides that these companies have given them. Right. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to see this. Right. And so, again, this is an example of how we need to think about the impact of these genetically modified organisms and what they're doing to us, right? This is an example of what I was talking about with price drops. This is the price of coffee over the last 45 years or so. As you can see, there is a hell of a fluctuation here. You're talking about it getting down to, this is the cost. This is the price that farmers are paid, right? Not what you and I are paying at Starbucks or better, a local coffee shop, because Starbucks sucks. But this is the price that farmers are actually paid. So you're talking about it's gotten down to less than a quarter, all the way up to about $3.50 a pound, right? That is a radical shift. How the hell do you plan on this? Especially because coffee plants take 5 years before you, get a harvest out of them. So you plant them and you're not going to make any money on this for 5 years. Well, looking at this chart, you can see you go from, 1985, where it's over 250 a pound, to 1990 when your first harvest comes in, and it dropped to $1 a pound. That's a real different thing. Hope you didn't borrow too much money. Hope you're not too far in debt, and so this massive fluctuation is a really, really bad problem. When you look at cash crops, things that you are growing for a profit, that is one of the downsides. If I'm growing food and the price drops, on the upside, I can at least just eat it. I might not make any money. I might not be able to afford like new clothes and things for the children and stuff like that, but nobody starves to death. The problem with getting into cash crops is that, I can't eat coffee. We ain't getting by on it. And so it is a serious thing where I'm taking a big risk. But of course, I need to, right? How else am I going to pay for my kids to go to school and have books and shoes and those kinds of things if I don't do this? But I run into a real serious risk here, right? So another thing that I want to talk about just a little bit is this idea of the food crisis, right? As we're talking about foodways and different farming practices, right? You may have heard of a guy named Thomas Malthus in some of your classes. Malthus was an economist very early on, and it's still probably the most one of the most dominant theories in both economics and in ecology. Is a very Malthusian perspective. And Malthus was the first guy that said that human beings will outbreed their food source, is that as our population grows, it is natural and normal that we will always sort of breed too much and we're going to run out of food. And this is something you hear a lot of. There's a lot of problems with this, most of which were pointed out by a woman named Esther Bosrup. And Bosrup actually, instead of, again, sort of sitting in the armchair and pontificating like Malthus did in 200 years ago, she actually looked at what people do, and she looked at the real world. And what she found was, in truth, as a population grows, we always find new ways to make food. And so as human populations grew, that's, 10,000 years ago, that's where you see us exploiting domestication. Your book talks about this with forager societies. I said that they're almost always nomadic. You could say that they're always nomadic, they always move around, except there's literally 3 examples where they aren't. In the entire history of the world, we have found 3 cultures that were foragers that didn't move around, and one of them was actually here in Florida, the Calusa Indians. Another was the Kwakiutl in the Pacific Northwest, and the third was a group living on the coast of Peru a couple thousand years ago. What all of these had in common was, as their population grew, they started exploiting a new resource, mainly maritime resources. So they were living near the ocean. They started doing some really large scale fishing, right? So these groups didn't before, but as they grew, they started to do this. As groups around the globe grew, we started planting, we started domesticating livestock. As our population started to grow, in the last century plus, we have genetically modified organisms now, right? We always adapt to our needs, right? And so this really nihilistic philosophy of Malthus, respectfully, it's just not what we see in actual life, And the last thing that I wanted to talk about just a little bit is income inequality. And I want to talk about this because, as I mentioned, there's an argument to be made that we really ought to talk about industrialized societies, maybe a little bit different than we do with just agricultural societies, because the truth is income inequality is a really serious issue. I mentioned before that anthropologists love to study forager societies. We have whole classes on them. Usually in anthropology classes, you'll oftentimes have to read articles and stuff like that about foragers. We talk about it all the time. And yet, as I said, there's maybe 750,000 of them left in the world. Like Manhattan's got more people than that, right? There's cities in Florida that have more people than that, right? this is not how most people are living, right? So let's talk about how people are actually living today, right? And in industrialized societies, one of the things that we see is that there is a tremendous amount of wealth inequality now. And this is having some really staggering impacts on our culture and our society as more and more people are no longer able to afford basic things like homes and, food. 47 million Americans last year experienced food insecurity, meaning that they didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. 14 million of those were children, right? And I've mentioned this before, I believe, but like in a forager society, there's no such thing as inequality. We're not rich, but all of us have the same amount and all of us are doing okay, right? This was quite famously, forager societies were quite famously called the original affluent society by somebody. And we don't think of them as affluent because they don't drive Teslas and they don't wear Rolex and they don't have, whatever kind of name brand stuff. But the truth is also nobody goes hungry. Nobody has want. All of their needs are met. You and I live in probably the richest culture that's ever existed in the history of the world, right? And yet there are people in that same culture who are starving, right? Who are have so little food that their children are not growing at the proper rate. We have individuals that die of exposure because they don't have homes. They have to sleep outside. A shocking number of whom are actually veterans, by the way. And so, I think that this is something that we really need to dial in more. This is a graph demonstrating the income shift from 1979, the year I was born, to 2007. And you'll notice that the bottom, second, middle, and fifth of the country all lost money in that time. The top fifth on average gained 38 grand, but the top 1% gained over almost $750,000 in income, right? We have a serious issue here, even as we exalt these people who have absolute decadence and at the expense of others, right? I often say, right, this is some zero equation. You can't pull a rubber band in one direction, right? If you're going to have this much growth in the top 1%, it has to come from somewhere, and it's going to come from the bottom 99%. Okay. Again, you can't pull a rubber band one way, right? If it stretches up here, it's got to stretch down somewhere else, right? And so even as we look up to Bill Gates and Elon Musk and Mark Cuban and all of these other people, you have to understand that those individuals are created at the expense of other individuals, okay? And so that's why I posted a video for this week that I want you guys to check out that talks about this absolutely staggering difference in income inequality, right? So that is it. Thank you guys very much. I will see you next time.